The Black Death, Villages Lost to Shadow. A haunting journey through the plague years. Welcome, gentle traveler, to dark medieval whispers from the past. I am glad you have found your way here tonight, to this quiet corner where history speaks in hushed tones and the past reaches out with tender, shadowed hands. Whatever has brought you to this moment, whether the need for peaceful sleep, the longing for meditative calm, or simply the desire to drift through the dark hours of a long journey, know that you are welcome here. You are safe here. Tonight, we walk together through one of history's most sorrowful chapters. Our journey is called the Black Death, Villages Lost to Shadow, and it will carry us through mist-shrouded lanes and silent churchyards, through the memories of people who lived and loved and endured when darkness fell upon their world. This is not a tale meant to frighten or disturb, but rather a gentle meditation on human resilience and the strange, melancholic beauty that can be found even in the deepest shadow. So settle yourself now. Let the tensions of your day fall away like autumn leaves drifting to the forest floor. Breathe slowly and deeply, and allow my voice to guide you backward through the centuries, to a time when the world moved more slowly and shadows held mysteries we have long forgotten. The medieval world awaits, patient and eternal, and its whispered stories will keep you company through whatever darkness surrounds you tonight. Let us begin. Part 1. The Shadow Approaches. The year was 1347, and across Europe, life continued as it had for generations beyond counting. In 10,000 villages scattered from the shores of the Mediterranean to the cold forests of the north, peasants rose with the sun and walked paths worn smooth by the feet of their ancestors. They tended crops that their grandparents had planted, worshipped in churches built by hands that had turned to dust centuries before, and fell asleep each night beneath thatched roofs that whispered with the wind. They could not know that their world was about to change forever, that shadow was already creeping toward them across distant seas, carried in the holds of ships and the blood of men who would never reach home. In a village we might call Ashford, though its true name has been lost to the forgiving mist of time, life moved with the gentle rhythm of the seasons. The village sat in a shallow valley where two streams met and continued together toward a river that eventually found its way to the sea. Perhaps 40 families called this place home, their cottages clustered around a stone church whose bell had rung out the hours for 300 years. The blacksmith's hammer sang its iron song each morning. Children chased geese through muddy lanes. Old women gathered at the well to share news and complaints in equal measure. It was an ordinary place, remarkable only in its ordinariness, in the way it represented countless other villages that dotted the countryside like seeds scattered by a careless hand. The lord of this valley lived in a modest manor house on the hill above the village, close enough to hear the church bell, but far enough to maintain the distance that nobility required. He was not a cruel man, this lord whose name we have also forgotten. He collected his rents and his tithes, settled disputes among his tenants with reasonable fairness, and attended Mass each Sunday in the family chapel where his father and grandfather lay beneath carved stone. His wife had given him 3 sons and 2 daughters, and he considered himself blessed by God and fortune alike. When he looked out from his chamber window at the village below, he saw the proper order of the world, unchanging and eternal as the hills themselves. In the church, Father Thomas performed his duties with the quiet devotion of a man who had long ago made peace with his calling. He had come to Ashford as a young priest full of reforming zeal, determined to root out the superstitions and half-pagan practices that peasants clung to despite centuries of Christian teaching. But the years had softened him, teaching him that faith wore many faces and that the old grandmother who left milk for the fairies might love God just as truly as the scholar who debated theology in distant universities. He baptized the newborn and buried the dead, heard confessions, and offered what comfort he could to those who suffered. His church smelled of old stone and candle smoke and the particular mustiness of books that few hands ever opened, and he loved it as he had never loved any living thing. The seasons turned with their ancient patience. Spring brought mud and new lambs and the exhausting work of planting. Summer burned golden over ripening fields. Autumn meant harvest and the anxious counting of stores against the coming cold. Winter drove everyone indoors to huddle around smoky fires and tell stories that their great-great-grandparents had told before them. Birth and death, marriage and mourning, the church bell ringing out its steady measurement of passing time. This was the heartbeat of medieval existence, and those who lived within it could imagine no other way of being. But far to the east, in lands that the villagers of Ashford had never seen and could barely imagine, something terrible was stirring. Merchants who traveled the Silk Roads brought back more than spices and silks. Sailors who put into port at Constantinople carried invisible passengers in their blood and their breath. The sickness moved with the speed of trade and travel, following the arteries of commerce that connected the known world. It had already consumed cities older than Rome, left kingdoms depopulated, and reduced proud empires to scattered survivors wandering through the ruins of their civilization. Now it turned its attention westward, toward the unsuspecting villages and towns of Christendom. The first rumors reached Ashford through a traveling merchant who stopped at the village in one autumn evening. He spoke of a pestilence in the southern lands, a sickness that killed with terrifying swiftness and left its victims marked with dark swellings that gave the disease its name. The villagers listened with the particular attention that people give to tales of distant disaster, finding in the misfortune of strangers both horror and a secret relief that such things happened elsewhere. The merchant moved on the next morning, and life in Ashford continued unchanged. What happened in Italy or France, or even London seemed as remote as the lives of saints in their gilded legends. Winter came early that year, the elders said, though in truth it arrived exactly when it always did. The villagers retreated to their smoky cottages and their familiar routines of survival. They mended tools and spun wool and told the old stories around fires that never quite drove away the cold. Father Thomas said his masses to congregations that grew smaller as the weather worsened, and the Lord in his manor house worried about the depleted stores of grain and the wolves that had been seen in the high pastures. These were the ordinary concerns of an ordinary winter, unremarkable and soon forgotten. In the darkness beyond the firelight, beyond the walls of cottage and church and manor house, the shadow continued its slow approach. It moved through ports where ships lay rotting because no sailors remained to man them. It crept along roads where bodies lay unburied because there was no one left to dig the graves. It entered cities through gates that stood open because the guards had fled or died, and it left those cities silent except for the crying of children who had lost everyone they loved. The shadow was patient. The shadow was thorough. The shadow was coming to Ashford, though no one in that sleeping village knew it yet. Spring arrived with its usual mix of hope and hardship. The streams swelled with snow melt, flooding the low-lying fields and washing away a footbridge that had stood for 50 years. The peasants grumbled as they always grumbled, but they also felt the stirring of relief that another winter had passed without famine or catastrophe. Lambs were born, and seedlings pushed through the dark earth, and the church bell rang out its Easter celebration across a valley that was coming back to life after the long sleep of cold months. It was in late spring that the peddler came. He was a thin man with a rattling cough and a cart full of ribbons and needles and other small goods that village women needed but could not make for themselves. Such peddlers came through Ashford several times each year, bringing news from the wider world along with their wares. This one brought stories of the pestilence, which had spread northward faster than anyone had imagined possible. It had reached the cities now, he said. London was in chaos. The king himself had fled to the countryside. The villagers listened and purchased their ribbons and went back to their work. They had heard such tales before, and cities were always falling prey to one plague or another. That was why sensible people lived in villages, where the air was clean and the community was small enough that everyone knew everyone else. The sickness was a punishment from God, the priest said in his Sunday sermon, a scourge sent to cleanse the world of its sins. But surely God would spare his faithful servants here in this quiet valley, where people worked hard and said their prayers and harmed no one. Surely the shadow would pass them by. The peddler stayed in the village for 3 days, selling his goods and sleeping in the stable behind the inn. On the second day, he complained of a headache and a heaviness in his limbs. On the third morning, the innkeeper found him dead in the straw, his neck and armpits swollen with lumps the size of eggs, dark as bruises and terrible to behold. The innkeeper crossed himself and ran for the priest, and by nightfall the entire village knew that the shadow had finally found them. In the days that followed, the sickness spread with a speed that seemed almost supernatural. The innkeeper's wife fell ill first, then their children, then the servants who had helped carry away the peddler's body. It moved from house to house like an invisible wind, striking some and sparing others according to a logic that no one could understand. Father Thomas performed last rites until his voice gave out, then continued in a hoarse whisper that was somehow more terrible than silence. The gravedigger dug until his hands bled, and still the bodies accumulated faster than he could bury them. The Lord in his manor house ordered the gates barred and forbade any contact with the village below. He stood at his window and watched the smoke rising from the church where candles burned for the dying, and he told himself that the walls around him were thick enough to keep out any shadow. But the sickness did not respect walls or titles or the desperate prayers of frightened men. It came for the Lord's household as surely as it came for the poorest peasant, and within a fortnight, the manor house had become as silent as the village it overlooked. Those who remained alive did what they could. Some fled into the forest, hoping that distance might save them where prayer had failed. Others stayed to care for the dying, knowing that their compassion would likely cost them their lives. Old Margaret, who had birthed half the children in the village and laid out their grandparents for burial, went from cottage to cottage with her herbs and her prayers, and somehow the shadow seemed to pass her by. She would survive the plague years, this tough old woman, and live to tell her stories to a new generation that could never quite believe what she described. The church bell stopped ringing when Father Thomas died. He had stayed at his post to the very end, offering comfort and absolution to his parishioners even as his own body failed. They found him slumped before the altar, his rosary still clutched in his blackened fingers, and those who still had strength to weep shed tears for a man who had earned their love through decades of quiet service. They buried him beside the church he had served for so long, in a grave that soon became indistinguishable from all the others that surrounded it. By summer's end, the village of Ashford had ceased to exist as a living community. Perhaps a dozen people remained where 40 families had once thrived. The survivors moved through empty lanes where weeds had already begun to grow, past cottages whose doors stood open to reveal the possessions of the dead. The blacksmith's forge was cold. The mill wheel stood still in the stream. The church waited in silence for a congregation that would never gather again, its candles extinguished, its shadows deep and permanent. In time, the survivors would drift away to seek what remained of their lives elsewhere. The village would be reclaimed by the forest and the fields, its cottages crumbling into picturesque ruins, its stories fading into the general tragedy of a continent that had lost a third of its people to the shadow. Future generations would walk past the overgrown remains and never know that this had once been a place of life and love and ordinary human struggle. The Black Death erased villages like words from a manuscript, leaving only blank spaces where communities had been. But the forgetting was not yet complete. In the last days of that terrible summer, when the dying had finally stopped and the survivors had begun to emerge from their shock, an old man sat alone in the church where Father Thomas had prayed. His family was gone, all of them, from his white-haired wife to his youngest grandchild who had just learned to walk. He had no tears left, no prayers, no understanding of why he had been spared when so many better people had perished. He sat in the darkness and listened to the silence and tried to remember the sound of the bell that had measured out the hours of his life. Perhaps, if we listen carefully, we can still hear its echo. Perhaps, in the spaces between our own heartbeats, we can catch the whispered memories of villages lost to shadow. They are part of us now, these forgotten places and forgotten people. Their sorrow has soaked into the earth and mingled with the rain and become part of the water that sustains us. Their stories have been told and retold and transformed into legend and myth. But beneath all the layers of time and telling, the truth remains. They lived, they loved, they suffered, they died. And in the end, that is all any of us can say. Rest now, gentle traveler. Let the weight of centuries settle around you like a soft blanket. The shadow has passed, and the dawn will come again, as it always does. Close your eyes and drift, and know that even in the darkest times, the light endures. Part 2. The silence between bells. In the wake of the shadow, the survivors faced a world they no longer recognized. The farms that had fed their families lay untended, crops rotting in fields where no hands remained to gather them. The animals that had survived wandered freely, sheep mixing with cattle in pastures where no shepherd watched over them. The rhythm of daily life, so familiar and unquestioned before the pestilence, had been shattered like a clay pot dropped on stone. Those who remained had to learn how to live again, how to find meaning in a world that death had transformed beyond all understanding. Across the countryside, in hundreds of villages just like Ashford, the same terrible silence had fallen. Travelers who passed through these places in the months after the plague found scenes that would haunt their dreams forever. Doors hanging open on empty cottages, gardens running wild with vegetables that no one would harvest, churches where the dead lay unburied because there was no one to perform the sacred rites. And everywhere, the crows and the rats, grown fat and bold on a feast that seemed to have no end. In a village whose name history has preserved as Thornfield, a young woman named Agnes emerged from the plague months to find herself utterly alone. Her husband had died in the first wave, her children in the second, her parents and siblings scattered throughout the churchyard in graves she had dug with her own hands. She was 23 years old and had expected to live out her days in this place where she had been born, surrounded by the familiar faces and familiar routines that gave life its meaning. Now she stood in the lane outside her cottage and could not imagine taking another step in any direction. The silence was what she noticed first. Not the absence of human voices, though that was terrible enough, but the absence of all the small sounds that had always formed the background of her existence. No chickens clucking in the yard, no dog barking at strangers, no children calling to each other as they played their games among the cottages. Even the birds seemed to have fled, leaving nothing but the wind moving through the empty spaces where life had been. Agnes did not know how long she stood there, paralyzed by a grief too vast to comprehend. Hours, perhaps, or days. Time had lost its meaning when the church bell stopped ringing, and without that steady measurement, she could not say where one moment ended and another began. She was aware of hunger and thirst only distantly, as if her body belonged to someone else and was sending messages that no longer concerned her. The sun crossed the sky and shadows lengthened and stars emerged, and still she stood, unable to move, unable to look away from the village that had become a monument to everything she had lost. It was a sound that finally reached her, a sound so familiar that it seemed to come from another lifetime. Somewhere beyond the edge of the village, a lamb was bleating for its mother. The cry was plaintive and persistent, a small voice calling out against the vast indifference of the world. Agnes found herself walking toward it without conscious decision, her feet carrying her down the lane and through the fields to where a young lamb stood alone beside the body of its dam. The mother sheep had been dead for some time, long enough that the lamb should have perished too. But somehow it had survived, perhaps drinking from the stream or finding sustenance in the grass. Its will to live stronger than the circumstances that should have killed it. Agnes knelt beside it and gathered it into her arms. And for the first time since the shadow had fallen, she wept. She wept for her husband and her children and her parents and her neighbors. She wept for Father Thomas and the Lord in his manor and the peddler who had brought death to a village that had never done him any harm. She wept for herself and for the lamb and for all the lost and lonely creatures left behind when the world they knew had been swept away. When her tears were finally exhausted, Agnes carried the lamb back to her cottage and found milk to feed it. She would keep this creature alive, she decided. She would care for it and protect it and give it a name that no one else would ever hear. This small act of nurturing, of maintaining one fragile life in the midst of so much death, became her reason to continue. The lamb became her companion, her responsibility, her connection to a future that she could not quite imagine but refused to abandon. In the weeks that followed, Agnes slowly began to reclaim her life. She tended her garden, not because she expected to survive long enough to harvest it, but because the familiar work gave her hands something to do besides tremble. She repaired her cottage and cared for her lamb and said prayers each morning and evening, though she was no longer certain that anyone was listening. The silence remained, vast and terrible, but within it she carved out a small space that was her own, a shelter against the emptiness that pressed in from all sides. Other survivors began to emerge as well, drawn together by the simple need for human contact. They came from neighboring villages and isolated farmsteads, seeking others who had endured the same unspeakable losses. Some were looking for news of relatives who had fled. Some were searching for meaning or explanation. Some simply needed to hear another voice, to be reminded that they were not the last people left alive in all the world. A kind of community began to form among these survivors, though it bore little resemblance to the communities they had known before. The old hierarchies and obligations had been swept away along with the people who had enforced them. A peasant might find himself living in a lord's abandoned manor, sleeping in feather beds that had once been reserved for nobility. A woman might take on work that had always been done by men, because there were no men left to do it. The rules that had governed every aspect of medieval life seemed suddenly irrelevant, relics of a world that the shadow had consumed. For some, this new freedom was terrifying. They clung to whatever remnants of the old order they could find, seeking guidance from priests who were themselves lost and frightened, trying to recreate the familiar structures that had given their lives meaning. But for others, the aftermath of the plague offered something unexpected: possibility. The land that had always been owned by lords now lay empty and unclaimed. The trades that had always been controlled by guilds now needed anyone willing to learn them. The future, so dark and uncertain, was also radically open in ways that no one could have imagined before the shadow fell. Agnes found herself changed by the months of solitude and grief. The timid young wife who had deferred to her husband in all things had been replaced by a woman who made her own decisions and answered to no one. She had faced death so intimately and so repeatedly that it had lost much of its power to frighten her. What remained was a kind of fierce determination to survive, to honor the memory of those she had lost by continuing to live as fully as she could. Her lamb grew into a healthy ewe, and Agnes acquired more animals, building a small flock that represented both her livelihood and her defiance of the darkness that had tried to consume her. The seasons turned, as they had always turned, indifferent to human suffering and human resilience alike. Autumn brought its harvest, meager compared to years past, but enough to sustain those who had survived. Winter closed in with its familiar cold, and the survivors huddled in their scattered shelters, drawing what warmth they could from small fires and smaller hopes. Spring returned, and with it the first timid signs that the world might continue after all. Flowers bloomed in untended gardens. Birds returned to build their nests. Children born in the shadow of the plague took their first steps and spoke their first words, knowing nothing of the world that had existed before. In some places, the church bells began to ring again. New priests came to fill the places left empty by the dead, young men who had been called to their vocation by the very catastrophe that had created the need for them. They stood in pulpits that still smelled of death and spoke words of comfort and warning to congregations that were desperate to hear them. The plague was a punishment for sin, they said. The survivors had been spared so that they might repent and build a better world. Whether or not anyone truly believed these explanations, they provided a framework for understanding the incomprehensible, a story that made sense of senselessness. But not all the churches found new voices to fill them. Many village parishes remained empty, their buildings slowly succumbing to weather and neglect. In these abandoned sanctuaries, the sacred objects gathered dust, and the carved faces of saints stared out over pews that would never hold worshippers again. Travelers passing through would sometimes stop to say a prayer in these silent spaces, moved by a reverence that transcended any particular faith. The churches had witnessed so much suffering, had offered what little comfort was possible in the face of the shadow, and now they stood as monuments to both human hope and human loss. The manor houses told their own stories of the plague years. Some had been stripped bare by survivors or opportunists, their furnishings carried away to provide comfort in humbler dwellings. Others stood untouched, preserved by some combination of superstition and respect, their great halls echoing with memories of feasts and gatherings that would never come again. In one such house, in a county whose name has been forgotten, a single servant remained, an old man who had served 3 generations of the family that now lay in the family chapel. He continued his duties out of habit and devotion, polishing silver that no one would use, lighting fires in hearths that no one would sit beside, waiting for a summons that would never come. When he finally died, the house died with him, and within a generation it was nothing but picturesque ruins for romantic poets to contemplate. The landscape itself bore the marks of the shadow's passage. Fields that had been cultivated for centuries returned to wilderness, their careful boundaries blurred by spreading vegetation. Roads fell into disrepair when there was no one to maintain them, becoming muddy tracks that were barely distinguishable from the surrounding countryside. Forests expanded into territories that had once been cleared, reclaiming land that human hands had shaped and tended for generations. The balance between civilization and nature, always precarious in medieval times, shifted decisively in favor of the wild. And yet, amid all this loss and transformation, something remarkable was happening. The survivors were not simply waiting to die or disappearing into despair. They were adapting, creating, building new lives from the wreckage of the old. They formed new families with partners they might never have chosen in ordinary times. They learned new skills because necessity demanded it. They developed new ways of thinking about themselves and their world, ways that would slowly, over generations, lead to transformations that their ancestors could never have imagined. Agnes was part of this quiet revolution, though she never thought of it in such grand terms. She simply did what she had to do to survive, and in doing so, she became someone new. She learned to barter and trade with the merchants who slowly began traveling the roads again. She figured out how to repair her own cottage and tend her own animals without male assistance. She discovered that she had a talent for healing, for mixing the herbs that could ease pain and reduce fever, and neighbors began seeking her out when illness struck their families. She was no longer just a widow, a victim, a survivor. She was Agnes the healer, Agnes with the fine sheep, Agnes who had faced the shadow and emerged stronger than before. The church in her village remained silent, its bell tower home only to birds who nested in the rotting timbers. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Agnes would walk to the churchyard and sit among the graves of everyone she had loved. She would tell them about her day, about the lamb that had grown into a fine ewe, about the neighbors who had moved into the empty cottages and brought life back to the desolate lanes. She did not know if the dead could hear her, but she hoped that somehow, in whatever place they had gone, they knew that she remembered them. She hoped that her survival honored their memory rather than mocking it. She hoped that she was living well enough to deserve the chance that fate or God or random fortune had given her. The silence between bells was not empty, Agnes discovered. It was full of small sounds that she had never noticed before when the ringing had measured out her days. The wind through the grass, the call of birds at dawn and dusk, the bleating of her sheep, her own breath, her own heartbeat, the quiet evidence that she was still alive. She learned to listen to these sounds and find comfort in them, to fill the silence with her own living presence rather than waiting for someone else to do it for her. The bells might ring again someday, or they might not, but either way, she would continue. She would persist. She would carry the memory of the lost into a future that she could not predict but refused to fear. Rest now, gentle traveler. Let the silence settle around you like a blanket woven from shadows and starlight. The survivors found their way through the darkness, and so will you. Close your eyes and breathe, and know that morning always comes, even after the longest night. Part 3. Wildflowers on Forgotten Graves. Years passed, then decades, then generations. The Black Death did not end with a single wave, but returned again and again throughout the century, each visitation claiming new victims and reopening old wounds. Those who survived the first great mortality often fell to later outbreaks, and those who survived those fell to the ordinary diseases and misfortunes that had always made medieval life precarious. But with each passing year, the survivors grew more numerous than the dead, and the shadow that had seemed so total began slowly, inexorably, to lift. In the places where villages had disappeared entirely, the forest completed its reclamation. Trees grew through the ruins of cottages, their roots breaking apart stones that human hands had laid with such care. Meadows covered what had once been market squares, their wildflowers nodding in breezes that carried no memory of the crowds that had once gathered there. The paths that had connected these villages to the wider world became indistinguishable from deer tracks, followed only by hunters who knew nothing of the communities that had once thrived along them. But the traces remained, visible to those who knew how to look. Here and there, a foundation stone could still be found beneath the undergrowth, carved with marks that signified ownership or blessed the dwelling against evil. In certain clearings, the ground was unnaturally level, marking the locations of houses that had been abandoned so long ago that even their decay had been absorbed by the earth. And in scattered churchyards throughout the countryside, stone crosses and crude wooden markers stood watch over the unnamed dead, weathered beyond legibility, but still testifying to lives that had once mattered to someone. One such churchyard lay in what had once been the village of Ashford, though no one called it that anymore. The church itself had collapsed during a winter storm sometime in the 15th century, and its stones had been gradually carried away by farmers who saw in them useful building material rather than sacred relics. Only the foundation remained, a rectangular outline in the grass, and within it, the graves of Father Thomas and his parishioners waited in silence for visitors who never came. In the summer of 1422, a young woman wandered into this forgotten place. Her name was Eleanor, and she was the granddaughter of survivors, born into a world that was slowly healing from wounds inflicted before her parents were born. She had been walking through the countryside for reasons she could not quite explain, drawn by a restlessness that her settled family could not understand. When she found the ruins of the church, she stopped and stared at them for a long time, trying to imagine what this place had been before the shadow fell. The graves were barely visible, Their wooden markers rotted away and their stone crosses tilted at angles that suggested centuries of neglect. Eleanor walked among them carefully, reading what inscriptions could still be read, touching the stones with something like reverence. She knew the stories, of course. Everyone knew the stories. The elders spoke of the plague years the way earlier generations had spoken of ancient invasions or mythical disasters, events so terrible that they had become almost legendary. But standing here, in this quiet place where real people had been laid to rest, Eleanor felt the reality of it pressing against her heart. She picked wildflowers from the meadow that had grown over the village and laid them on the graves. It seemed like the right thing to do, though she could not have said why. The dead were strangers to her, people whose names and faces she would never know, but they were also her ancestors in a sense that transcended biology. They were the ones who had faced the shadow so that she could exist, the ones whose suffering had made possible the world she took for granted. The least she could do was remember them, even if she did not know their names. That night, Eleanor slept in the ruins of the church, wrapped in her cloak against the summer dew. She dreamed of the village as it might have been before the shadow came, full of ordinary sounds and ordinary people going about their ordinary lives. She saw the blacksmith at his forge and the women at the well, the children playing in the lanes, and the priest walking toward the church to ring the morning bell. They seemed happy in her dream, these people who had no idea what was coming for them. They seemed blessed in their ignorance, able to live fully in each moment without the burden of knowing that all moments must end. When she woke, the dawn was breaking over the ruins, painting the old stones with gold and rose. Eleanor lay still for a long time, watching the light change and listening to the birds welcome the new day. She felt strangely peaceful, as if the dream had been a gift from the dead, a glimpse of the life they had wanted her to have. The grief of the place was real, she understood now, but it was not the only thing that lingered here. There was also love, stubborn and enduring, the love that had bound these people together in life and kept their memory alive even after their names had been forgotten. Across the countryside, similar scenes were playing out in similar places. The descendants of survivors were rediscovering the lost villages of their ancestors, drawn by curiosity or family stories or the same inexplicable restlessness that had brought Eleanor to Ashford's ruins. Some came seeking treasure, having heard tales of valuables abandoned when whole families died and there was no one left to inherit. Others came seeking knowledge, scholars and chroniclers who were trying to understand what had happened during the shadow years and what it meant for the world that had emerged from them. What they found, almost always, was more affecting than any treasure. They found the personal possessions of the dead, the tools and household items that had been left behind when their owners could no longer use them. They found the graves and the ruins and the overgrown paths that spoke of lives interrupted. They found evidence of a world that had seemed so permanent to those who lived in it, but had proved as fragile as morning mist when the shadow touched it. And they found, perhaps most importantly, a mirror for their own mortality, a reminder that their world too could end without warning, that everything they built and loved and took for granted could be swept away as thoroughly as these forgotten villages had been. The lesson was humbling, but it was also strangely comforting. If the shadow had not destroyed humanity, if life had continued and even flourished after such terrible loss, then perhaps the future was not as dark as it sometimes seemed. Perhaps resilience was part of what it meant to be human, an inheritance passed down from those who had faced the worst and somehow found the strength to continue. The wildflowers blooming on the forgotten graves were proof of this continuity. Beauty growing from sorrow, life emerging from death, hope persisting against all odds. Agnes did not live to see her grandchildren, but her memory survived through the people she had helped during her years as the village healer. They spoke of her with respect and affection, this tough old woman who had faced the shadow alone and emerged to care for others. They passed down her remedies and her stories, her advice and her fierce independence, to generations who had never known her but who benefited from her wisdom nonetheless. In this way, Agnes achieved a kind of immortality, not through monuments or records, but through the living tradition of her community. Her sheep thrived as well, their descendants forming flocks that could be traced back to that single lamb she had rescued in the terrible summer of the plague. There was something almost mythical about this lineage, a thread of life reaching back through the shadow years to a moment of compassion that had made all the difference. The farmers who tended these flocks in later generations did not know the full story, but they sensed something special in the bloodline, a hardiness and resilience that seemed to carry the blessing of survival. The world that emerged from the plague years was not the world that had existed before them. It was a world transformed by loss, but also by the opportunities that loss had created. The old systems of labor and land tenure had been disrupted beyond repair, and in the confusion, ordinary people found chances for advancement that would have been impossible in the rigid hierarchies of the past. The church, which had failed so spectacularly to protect its flock or explain why God had permitted such suffering, faced questions and challenges that would eventually contribute to far-reaching reforms. The very concept of death itself was changed, made more visible and more personal, forcing philosophers and artists to grapple with mortality in ways that would shape culture for centuries to come. In the quiet places where the lost villages slept beneath their blankets of wildflowers and forest, the ghosts of the past kept their vigil. They were not ghosts in the literal sense, not spirits haunting the ruins of their former lives. They were something more subtle and more powerful, memories embedded in the land itself, traces of existence that persisted long after the people who had left them were forgotten. The streams that had once powered mills continued to flow. The hills that had once formed boundaries between parishes continued to rise and fall. The stars that had once guided travelers continued to wheel through the night sky, indifferent to the dramas of human history playing out beneath them. Sometimes, even now, someone walking through the countryside will stumble upon a place that feels different from its surroundings. The air will seem heavier there, or quieter, or charged with some indefinable significance. The traveler may find traces of old stonework beneath the undergrowth, or notice that the trees grow in patterns that suggest ancient boundaries. In such moments, if the traveler is sensitive enough to feel it, they may sense the presence of those who came before, the ordinary people who lived and loved and suffered and died in this place when the world was younger and the shadow had not yet fallen. These lost villages are not truly lost, then. They are merely waiting, patient and eternal, for someone to remember them. They are part of the earth now, their substance mingled with the soil and their stories woven into the fabric of the land. They are part of us, their descendants, carrying in our blood and our traditions the legacy of survival that they purchased at such terrible cost. When we pause to honor them, when we lay wildflowers on their forgotten graves, we complete a circle that began in the shadow years and has never really ended. The medieval world was a place of darkness and light, of suffering and beauty, of despair and stubborn hope. The people who lived in it were not so different from us, really. They worried about their children and dreamed of better futures and feared the unknown terrors that lurked beyond the edge of the firelight. They loved their families and their villages and their familiar routines, and when those things were taken from them, they grieved as we would grieve. But they also persevered, as we would persevere. They found reasons to continue living when it seemed like life itself had lost its meaning. They rebuilt what the shadow had destroyed and made something new from the ruins. This is the gift they left us, these ancestors whose names we will never know. Not treasure or territory or any tangible inheritance, but something far more valuable, the knowledge that survival is possible, the knowledge that love endures even when everything else is lost, the knowledge that wildflowers will bloom on forgotten graves, and children will play in meadows where villages once stood, and the world will continue turning no matter how dark the shadow or how deep the grief. Rest now, gentle traveler. Let the weight of centuries settle softly around you, a comforting presence rather than a burden. The stories of the lost villages have been told, and in the telling, something has been preserved. Sleep deeply and dream peacefully, knowing that you are part of this great tapestry of human existence, connected to all who came before and all who will come after. The shadow has passed. The dawn is breaking. The wildflowers are blooming, and somewhere, perhaps, a church bell is beginning to ring again. And so we come to the end of our journey through the shadow years, dear traveler. We have walked together through villages lost to time, sat beside the graves of people whose names the centuries have forgotten, and witnessed the quiet courage of those who survived when so many did not. The Black Death left scars on Europe that took generations to heal, but it also revealed the remarkable resilience of the human spirit, the capacity to find hope and meaning even in the darkest of times. Thank you for allowing Dark Medieval, Whispers from the Past to be your guide through this melancholic meditation. If these whispered stories have brought you peace, if they have helped you drift toward restful sleep or kept you company through a long journey, then we have accomplished what we set out to do. The past has gifts to offer us, if we are willing to listen. It has lessons about loss and survival, about the fragility of everything we take for granted, and the stubborn persistence of everything that truly matters. If you have found comfort in this quiet corner of history, please consider leaving a like to help others find their way here too. Share your thoughts in the comments, where fellow travelers gather to reflect on these whispered tales. And if you have not already done so, subscribe to Dark Medieval, Whispers from the Past, so that you may join us for future journeys into the shadows of ages past. Until we meet again, may your dreams be peaceful and your nights be filled with the gentle comfort of remembered stories. The medieval world will be waiting, patient and eternal, whenever you need to escape from the brightness and noise of the present into the quiet embrace of the past. Farewell, gentle traveler. Sleep well.